Hello, and welcome to the first installment of 929 English's new project, 24 in 24. So we learn all sorts of tidbits from these names. So as we learned that 929 is the number of chapters of prakim in Tanakh and the Hebrew Bible, now we learn that there are 24 books in the Hebrew Bible. And we also learn that there are 24 days between now and Passover, now and Pesach. 25 days from now, we will be eating matzah, we're reclining and drinking our wine. So between now and then, we're going to try a lightning fast introduction overview of the entire Tanakh. So my name is Aaron Kohler. I teach in Yeshiva University. I teach Biblical and Near Eastern Studies. And it is my great privilege to be with you here for this first day of 24 and 24, as it has been my great privilege to be a frequent contributor to 929 English over the past couple of years. We know that 3.5 years to finish Tanakh, to finish the Hebrew Bible, is a very long time. And so this is an opportunity to get an overview. We're going to do each day a video, 20, 25 minutes, with some key points from each of the books, so that by the end of the 24, when we enter the Festival of Freedom, when we enter Passover, we will be able to say, in all seriousness, that we are acquainted with all 24 books of the Hebrew Bible. So we're going to start with Bereishit. It's my honor to start with the beginning. And of course, Bereishit means in the beginning, which seems like a good place to start. So we are going to start at the very beginning. The very beginning, of course, is the story of creation. The story of creation, there are in fact two stories of creation. The first one that certainly every child knows, certainly in Jewish schools and I think actually in all American schools generally, is the one that has 7 days, where there's 7 days of creation. Each day you have the creation of light and the creation of the sky and the creation of plants. And then on the fourth day, the creation of the sun, moon, stars, creation of birds and fish on the fifth day, and the creation of land animals on the sixth day, followed by or capped off by the creation of humanity. That's then followed, once we have human beings, by the creation of Shabbat, God's sanctuary in time, a sacred time, and the first thing that is said to be sacred in Tanakh. But there is a second story of creation, and whereas the first story of creation is very much a story about God, it's true that there are humans created in the story, but the story is primarily a story of God, who creates each day, and at the end sanctifies the seventh day. The second story, Genesis 2 and 3, Bereishit Bet and Gimel, the story of Gan Eden, of the Garden of Eden, is a story about humanity. That doesn't mean there's no God in the story, but it means that the primary characters in this story are in fact human beings. And more important, I think it actually is a story about what it means to be a human being, as opposed to the first story in Genesis 1, which is much more a story about the relationship between God and the created world generally. So the second story, and you see, of course, Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights from more than 500 years ago, is a story with a magical garden, which I assume is not a real place. This is not a historical story. This is a story that is a meditation on a world that does not exist. So that's what I'm going to try to work through with you over the next few minutes. And that this story uses the Garden of Eden to explore what humanity is not, by way of highlighting what humanity is, what it means to be a human being in the real world, not a magical garden planted by God. So we're going to work through a couple of parts of this story, and we're going to look at them fairly quickly. So of course, the garden is in fact a magical garden. It's planted by God, and God has 2 trees in it that are singled out, besides all the other trees that are not singled out. And those are very famously the tree of life and the tree of knowing good and evil. Now, really important to realize at the beginning that the tree of knowing good and evil is off limits, forbidden to the Adam. We'll talk more about that in a second. But the tree of life is not off limits. The tree of life was never legislated about. And so we assume, I think this is correct, that was actually fair game for Adam to consume. And I think it seems fair. We won't work through all these details, but I think it seems fair to assume from the end of the story that in fact the tree of life would in fact grant immortality. that if Adam were in the Garden of Eden allowed to eat from the tree of life, he could have lived there forever. Now, of course, Adam, the word comes from the word Adama. That's explained explicitly in the text. And that's why I'm translating it here just as earth creature to try to highlight the fact that the Adam, Ha-Adam, is not a code name for human being. It really highlights the fact that he is an earth creature. But it is a he, and it's explicitly gendered. And that becomes very important as the story goes on. So the key point in chapter 2 comes towards the end of the chapter when God says, well, it's not good. Lo tov heyot Adam levado. And it's often noted, and this is really important to notice, that whereas in chapter 1, God looks at everything and says, it is good, tov. This is the first time that God has looked at anything in the Bible and said, it's not good. And what's not good is human loneliness. I wouldn't just say aloneness, as an important distinction that many have made, but loneliness is not good. And that, of course, is poignant. I'm sure many of you, like us, are more or less alone at home right now, barred from going to school, from work, teaching via Zoom, and all sorts of potentially loneliness creating things. But while we are alone, we're trying to overcome loneliness by, in fact, finding kindred spirits in our home and outside of our home in all sorts of ways. So God says, well, it's not good for the Adam to be alone, to be lonely. I'm going to make a partner helpmate for him. And I left that sort of weird in the English because it's a little bit troubling or ambiguous in the Hebrew as well. And the test is, God says, well, I'm going to make all these animals and bring them to the Adam and see if he recognizes in any of them a nefesh chaya, a living soul. Now, we had earlier been told that the Adam was nefesh chaya. So the question basically is, will the Adam recognize in any of these other animals a kindred spirit? I mean, literally a spirit, that's akin to the Adam. So you imagine like this as a cosmic game of speed dating. God brings the newly created crocodile, and then the hippopotamus, and then the shrew mouse, and each of them, Adam, like tries to engage in conversation. Now, I don't know whether any of them are imagined to have been able to talk. You remember that in the story, the snake actually can talk. So it's conceivable that the story sort of imagining them as capable of speech. But that's not really the question. The question is not whether they can answer. The question is whether you can have a conversation. And that's what the point that Adam seems to be learning here, and I think actually that God seems to be trying to teach him here, is that although in a lot of ways you're going to see other animals, you're going to say like, hey, they're similar to me. You know, they walk around the garden, they eat the same fruits, they sleep in the same way that I sleep, they have all sorts of bodily needs that I have as well. But when you engage in a conversation, you notice that there's something actually qualitatively different here. They're not a nefesh chaya. And so for the earth creature, for the Adam, he found no partner helpmate. So the point seems to be not so much, although one could discuss this, but I guess I'll go with the view now that the point is not so much that God wasn't sure whether the crocodile would be an ezer kenegdo, a helpmate for the Adam, but rather that he wanted to teach the Adam that although you might see other creatures around, you're not quite like any of them. You're actually different in some almost unspeakable way, but really profoundly important way from all these other creatures. So of course, the next part, God says, okay, well, let me actually bring you a new creature that will be an ezer kenegdo, and he does it by taking the rib, assuming that's what Selah means. It's a little bit of a question, but taking the rib and building it into another creature called an Isha. And the Adam exclaims in poetry, Zot hapam etzem me'atzamai v'asar mi-b'sari l'zot yikarei Isha ki mi-ish lukecha zot. This is the one. This time, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called Isha, woman, because she was taken from Ish, man. And it's really important to realize that although that sounds just like a one-directional etymology, in other words, she's Isha because he's an Ish, which all you Semitists out there are going to point out is a folk etymology, not a real etymology, but that's not so important for us right now. But what is important is to realize that it's not actually a one-directional etymology, because he has never been called Ish until this point either. So whereas her name comes from his name was new because of her. So she discovers that she's an Isha because he's an Ish, but at the same time, he discovers that he's an Ish because she's an Isha. In other words, until now, he's been just an earth creature. The first time he becomes a man is when he encounters an Isha. And there is a heteronormativity to this that is, I think, should be observed, but not really explained away. This is the assumption that he will become Ish when she becomes Isha. But at the same time, she's an Isha because he's an Ish. So he discovers his own identity just through discovering her relationship to him. And that, I think, is a really profound lesson for human relationships. The lesson seems to be that as he discovers what makes an Ezer Kenegdo, what makes a fitting helpmate for him, that's also when he discovers who he actually is. And to some extent, his own sense of identity emerges from seeing it in dialogue and conversation with her identity and with the way he and she relate to each other. Now, that, of course, is chapter 2, which is, I think, actually a really beautiful and profound reflection on this question of individualism and relationships and how those actually work in tandem with one another. In chapter 3, of course, everything goes badly because they do eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov Hara, the tree of knowing good and evil. And so, to make a long story short, and I'll encourage you to dwell on it a bit more and make it back to being a long story. But for our purposes, make a long story short, they get kicked out of the garden, and each one gets their own punishment. We're also not talking about the serpent now, which is obviously important, but we're just going to focus on the human beings. So the two punishments seem to be a pair. And we'll say these pretty quickly. So remember that the way I think the story works, the human beings could have been immortal. They had access to the Eitz HaChaim, they had access to the tree of life. And as long as they were in the garden, they could have stayed there eating from the Eitz HaChaim. I have no idea how long it lasted. So I don't know if they had to eat from the fruit every Tuesday or once a month or once and forevermore or whatever the case may be. But they could have been immortal. Now, the woman's punishment is be'etzev teldi vanim, that you will bear children with sorrow. And the important interpretive question is, well, what would it have been without this punishment? Of course, one possibility is painless childbirth. And that's not impossible to imagine because, of course, if human beings look around in the world, they notice lots of other animals give birth to babies, and even mammals who give birth to live young seem to do it really much more effortlessly than human beings do. So, maybe you've seen a video of like a horse walking in the field, stopping, giving birth to a little baby foal. The foal's up and walking in about 30 seconds, and the mom continues on her way. Given all we know about human childbirth, the real dangers involved, as well as all that we do to make it possible and make it safe, this is sort of shocking. So, we have our modern evolutionary explanations for that difference. But so one possibility is that the imagined converse of this is that in the Garden of Eden, there would have been painless childbirth just like horses. But I think a more compelling explanation or a compelling interpretation is actually that there simply wouldn't have been childbirth because the human beings would have been immortal. The Ish and Isha would have lived forever. Their job consists of gardening, and forever they would have walked around the garden, le'ovda u'l'shamra, guarding the garden and working it, taking care of God's garden, and that would have been their life. And by life, I mean their eternal life. That's it. God now has these gardeners. And that may be painless, but it's also meaningless. Be'etzev taldi banim, you will bear children with sorrow, means, look, yes, there'll be sorrow, but you will bear children. There's actually you're going to produce something that will, first of all, physically outlive you, but also in which you can invest your hopes and dreams to actually do something meaningful for the world. You can produce something that's not just taking care of a garden, in other words, keeping things the same, but actually, hopefully, paving the way for another generation that will be in a better situation than you are. And the pair to that is the punishment for the man, Adam again, who's now an Adam, not an Ish, who is told, because of what you did, the ground will be cursed, but b'ze'at apecha tochal lechem. Through the sweat of your brow, you'll eat bread until you die. Ad shuvcha el ha'adama. Now, again, the sweat of the brow sounds like a lot of hard work, but I want to focus on the second part, tochal lechem. You'll eat bread. Now, in the garden, there was no bread. In the garden, they were eating whatever fruits they happened to find on the trees, which was presumably all the nutrition they needed, and I'm sure it were very delicious. But now you have the opportunity, that's painful, but it's an opportunity to actually create and invest in something that's going to produce something not natural. You're going to take this cursed land and you're going to work it, and it's going to be backbreaking labor. And some historians have pointed out the birth of agriculture also gave us gender hierarchies, gave us class structures, gave us all sorts of negative parts of our world. But there is an upside. Through all that, tochal lechem, you actually can produce bread. And bread and children seem to be the metaphors here for the opportunity to do something that's going to be painful, but has the chance of being redemptive. But you're going to take a world that's full of pain and suffering, and you're going to invest in it, and you're going to suffer with it. And that might be painful, and it almost certainly will be, but it also means that you have the chance of leaving the world a better place than when it came in. And that's something different from the sort of imagined existence in the Garden of Eden, where there was no chance of changing anything. And this is also very different from all other animals. So this is something that, again, the story seems to be focused on, is that Ish and Isha have to realize that they are not like horses. I'm sorry for picking on horses, but they're not like horses. And that's both in apparently good ways, meaning horses have some advantages, that they don't seem to be in pain when they give birth. They also find whatever they need to eat lying around. So of course we've domesticated them, so it's a little bit more complicated, but in any event, wild horses, find what they find the grasses to eat, and they are fine with that. But there's a downside to that, and this seems to be the Torah's point in the story. The downside is that horses are also not existentially anxious about their place in the world or leaving the world a better place. And while sometimes we might wish we weren't so existentially anxious, actually, that's what gives our life, that's what endows our lives with meaning. The anxiety that we feel about our existence is what allows us to actually aspire to doing something that's meaningful in life. And children in agriculture are the key to that. Children in agriculture are metaphors for things that are painful and we suffer for, but we wouldn't give up because they allow us the chance to see a redemptive act in our lifetime. Now, we know that we're going to die, but we might leave something behind that's actually improved the world. So that's, I think, basically what's going on. There is a subtext here that the text is trying to think through. Well, what does it mean for humans to be different from animals? Are we then divine? And of course, the answer is like, no, not quite divine. At the end of chapter 3, one of the reasons, or the reason given why human beings have to leave the Garden of Eden, is that they can't consume from the Eitz HaChaim. Because if humans were both knowledgeable, had eaten from the tree of knowledge, and immortal, then they would actually be divine. Maybe not exactly like God, but in some sense divine. So in some way, human beings exist on a plane in between the divine and the animals. And that's actually a theme that a number of texts come to in different ways. So just very quickly, in Psalm 8, so a passage that I find really stirring, because I think it's psychologically and emotionally a profound point. When I see your heavens, the handiwork of your fingers. When I was on a clear night, and maybe in the city this is hard to do, but on a clear night, when you look up to the stars, you look up to the cosmos, and you see the moon and the stars which you established, the thought that comes to the poet is, Ma enosh ki tizkerenu, ben adam ki tifkedenu. What am I? I mean, what is humanity? Our lives are transient. These stars seem to be permanent for the psalmist, we could talk about them as impermanent, but still billions of years. And our life, 70 years, 80 years, 90 years, 100 years. But this is nothing compared to the time scale of the cosmos. And of course, spatially, we're just so tiny. And yet, and yet, in some sense, we're endowed with a spirit from our Creator that makes us just a little bit less than divine, crowned with glory and honor. The Talmud in Chagiga puts it in a little bit more earthy terms. 3 things about humans that are similar to angels, and 3 that are similar to animals. 3 like angels: intelligence, walk upright, and speak Hebrew. I would focus on the speak rather than the Hebrew. But in 3 ways like animals: eat and drink, procreate, and pass gas. In other words, bottom line, we are mortal. We have all our bodily functions that are remind us of our mortality and our physicality on a daily basis. And we go back and forth between thinking, hey, you know what, we're actually not so different from a horse, and hey, you know what, we're not so different from an angel. We're not so far from being divine. So that story seems like a really important story for starting off the Torah. In other words, the first story, Genesis 1, is about God. The second story is, well, what does it mean to be human? What it means to be human is that you're somewhere in between the divine and the animal realms. And that's really important for now thinking about covenant, commandments, all sorts of obligations on humanity that are inconceivable without some sort of attention being paid to just what it means to be a human in general. Now, the rest of the book of Bereishit, which we won't study together, but just sort of point the way forward. The first part can be read as God's search for a home on earth. Now, Shabbat played that role to some extent. The Garden of Eden is imagined to play that role to some extent as well. But of course, once humanity is kicked out, it's not a meeting place between God and humanity. Then within a couple of chapters, the entire earth, at least humanity, is so corrupt that God feels the need to flood the entire earth and just start creation all over again. Following that, we get the Tower of Babel, which of course is another place where all of humanity had the potential of doing something good, but somehow, and enigmatically to some extent, messed up. And so God felt the need to scatter them. After that, we have 70 nations, and God has given up hope of being God of humanity. Instead, he moves to plan B or C or whatever he might be up to at that point, which is choosing one person, choosing, of course, Abraham, and sending him from Haran or from Ur to Canaan, and selecting him to be the founder of a family, and then what develops into a nation, where God will in fact find a home. But that, of course, is not going to happen until the book of Exodus. So that is more or less what we have in the book of Genesis. Obviously, just a couple of highlights, but I think some profound points in the book of Genesis. There is a reason that these stories are at the beginning. It's not just chronological, it's also foundational. The Torah starts off with stories thinking about what it means to be a human being in God's world, what it means to be a human being in the natural world, and how humanity is going to navigate this dichotomy in its own identity. All right, so that's it for Genesis. I will encourage you to follow 929 English on social media, sign up for the email on the listserv so you can find out about each episode of 24 and 24. And hopefully you'll continue with us in this endeavor, in this project, and throughout the year on our major project of completing each of the 929 chapters of Tanakh over the course of 3.5 years. And stay tuned for all sorts of events that we'll be doing in the coming weeks, and I look forward to learning with you more.